on your team, which is the maximum you can have plus your hero character. Assuming you weren't trying to heal or keep anyone alive at all, you would need basically the maximum amount of damage every turn in order to hit the health caps of those monsters, in order to hit the turn limit that is required to sort of advance certain things. I'd be very curious to see how well that was tested, if at all, because frankly, while I don't think it's impossible, I do think it would be more down to RNG than it is anything else. Because if you do anything like, miss or simply have to take a turn healing or deal with the boss's effects that actually remove your buffs or put your character to sleep and have to be, woken up at that point, you're basically just rolling the dice on whether or not this is successful, and I don't particularly find that to be compelling as far as difficulty for various games goes. So while I do want to make it clear it's absolutely not impossible, I also just don't think the late game, especially on Draconian mode, was very well thought out, to be fair, and I just wanted to throw that in here. But luckily, the game makes up for it in other places, and I was having a ton of fun besides just that. So let's talk a little bit more about those things. Starting first with the story setup and my thoughts on it. So in many ways, I would say this is like classic JRPG type stuff, but on the other, they do actually do some really fun things at moments during the story. Like there is part of it where one of your companions, who is typically not going to be like a named or voiced person, just a sort of generic NPC you add to your party, gets used in a main story side quest where you have to build up a town with them.
What? You took my mouse off the screen perfectly to stop me from fighting. Just enough, that millisecond, for me to die. You piece of shit.
And personalities ultimately decide things like stat growth, though this is also not a permanent choice and can be changed later, so I wouldn't take it too seriously. But after that, we wake up in our house only to find out that we have been summoned to the king's castle, where it is requested that we take up our father's mission, Ortega, who was trying to overthrow the archfiend Baramos, but it has by all accounts failed, and somebody else has to do it or things are going to go south. And thus, you set about your task. This initially starts out by just exploring the world's immediate problems, finding a way to the mainland before getting your own boat, before eventually the goddess herself speaks to you, giving you a little bit of direction, such as finding the orbs of light, reawakening the Everbird as it's known, giving you access to just flight in general for the world map,
God damn it.
quest to find and slay the archfiend. And in many ways, it's a very straightforward hero's game. But where I think the game is at its best is when it's doing things you don't quite expect, like I mentioned with the merchant earlier. That's a required main story thing you've got to do in order
Please
to
block, please block.
And it was a delightful way to, I would say, circumvent how typically games like this don't have a lot of interaction with NPCs that aren't like typically big party members. They don't have a story attached to them, for instance. So in this one instance, that actually isn't the case at all. Something happens with one of those party members in a big way. And then the game also has a day-night cycle, and there is a part of the quest that makes pretty good use of that via things like the village of Faden, which is completely destroyed, and you have to go there at night in order to interact with anybody or the ghosts of those people to learn what you need to learn, while also coming back during the day to do a couple things. So a lot of times the quests, even for the main story, interact with the game's mechanics in fun ways, which is especially fun for stuff like your abilities that are useful outside of combat. Not everything is combat related here. You will get abilities like safe passage that allow you to traverse hazardous terrain without actually being hurt. There is an item that can turn your characters invisible for a short while, so you can sneak past guards in some cases. And the game had just a whole host of little things like that that I wasn't expecting that I think really made the experience a lot better, which definitely made me see why people enjoyed this game so much, as it does really have some great moments in there. And doing all of that while exploring this big, kind of open world map, or overworld map if you prefer, without being handed like a specific list of go here, do this thing. In many cases, the game actually tells you to just straight up explore and figure it out, like for finding the orbs as an example. Though to the remake's credit, they did make this a little bit easier by highlighting the most important stuff on the world map so you don't get entirely lost. But even then, they don't tell you exactly what to do there. So I think the game does strike a good balance of giving you a little bit of a push in the right direction without holding your hand through it either. So all in all, main story-wise, quite good, really. More so than I was expecting, which is always nice to see. But let's talk about one of the biggest things this game has going for it, and that is its progression systems. So Dragon Quest III here uses both traditional stuff like, leveling, XP, base stat increases, gear, that kind of thing. Gear having various effects on certain enemies, that kind of stuff, but also more interesting things like being able to change your class and vocation, which then affects your stats. And if you level up multiple classes individually before getting to the one you really want, you'll have better stats for it. And then I also want to talk about things like the Sage and the Monster Wrangler, that kind of stuff. So right away, though, we do have our basic level ups. You kill enemies, you get experience. This levels your characters up. As they level, they pick up unique abilities tied to their vocation or their class. At least for your party members, your hero is just a hero. I will say that with you not being able to change their vocation and the fact of just how overpowered the Monster Wrangler winds up being, your main character starts off great, but they kind of fall off and become primarily your healer through the late game, especially with their Omni Heal, which is a full heal for your entire party, on top of being able to full heal individual characters with the abilities they learn. Now, your main hero also gets a variety of useful stuff like the fast travel spell Zoom, Holy Protection to ward off low-level encounters, and stuff like that. So your hero is useful, but probably not as much of a main character syndrome type thing as you would expect, especially in the late game when their damage really falls off in comparison to other classes. Now, for the rest of your party, the 3 that you can carry with you and any other characters you happen to make but are sent back to the tavern to rest at, you'll simply make these characters or recruit them from a predetermined list. Basically, the game has a spot in the starting town known as Pals. This is where you're going to recruit your other party members. Now, these characters can be any one of the, let's say, base classes, such as a warrior, a mage, a priest,
fucking
etc.
die,
Now,
asshole.
These characters also have personalities and everything.
Please.
Which is, again, important for stat growth.
Shouldn't have to
but
beg.
as a reminder, can
Please
still
pick
be
up the
changed
loot.
later. But the first thing to probably know, really, is that early on you'll probably want a thief, as they are extremely useful in the early game and pretty much useless in the late game, meaning that when we get to the point where we can switch vocations, we'll probably take someone out of thief and into something more useful once we've got all their abilities on a character. And that's kind of the general thinking you need to have. You probably want to start with the things you want to get out of the way first before transferring those characters to their, I would say, more final professions later on. Now, for some of these professions, that can take a little while because they get their final abilities up in the level 40 range, which is decently high for this game. But regardless of where you start, you're likely going to end with your hero and 3 monster wranglers because they are ridiculous. Now, in addition to these starting classes, however, there is one more, and it's actually a pretty important one to put whoever your caster is in, because that is the Sage. Basically, the Sage can learn all of the mage and priest spells on a single character at the same time, basically. So this makes the Sage really good for learning all of the spells on a single person, or pretty much all of them, which is generally pretty handy. Now, the catch with the Sage is that you can only put someone in that profession or class by finding the Words of Wisdom book, and there's only a couple of those throughout the game until you get to the very end where you'll finally be able to put people into that profession without actually expending the book as a consumable item. Gadabout is basically a clown, and they can do like random buffs on the enemy or you, but can also randomly debuff the enemy or you, which makes them inconsistent at best, which is always the worst type of character. But then the big one I really want to talk about is the Monster Wrangler.
Please keep the mouse on the screen.
Monster Wranglers start out
Please
pretty
keep the
slow.
mouse on
They're
the
not
screen.
really good at
Please
any
keep the
one
mouse on the
particular
screen.
thing, but
Please
rather
keep it
they
on the
seem
screen.
to fill the
Please.
gaps left by
Worthless
other
piece of
classes.
shit
At least
developer.
in the early parts
Fuck
of the game,
you.
for instance, they get
You and
access
Windows.
to a group
I hope you
heal,
lose
which
your
takes
industry.
much longer to get
I think you're
other
going
ones.
to.
But realistically,
Every day you
their true
torture me
power
all
has
day
nothing to do
long.
with their
You gotta
spells
stop.
at all. It
You're
is
gonna lose your
actually
industry.
tied to a monster
You're gonna lose all this if you keep treating me like this. Keep my mouse on the screen, piece of shit developer.
This means you can occasionally find docile monsters about in the world. And if you have a monster wrangler with you, you can just actually catch that monster every single time, whereas without a monster wrangler, you might be able to simply approach it, or you might have to use other classes' abilities to either silence your footsteps or make yourself invisible, like I mentioned, in order to catch
Nice!
Now,
Great design! Worthless piece of shit developer! Great design! Really good, I really like it.
Tied to how many of these monsters you have found, and once you get over 100, that's where things start getting crazy, because of 2 abilities the Monster Wrangler has that nobody else does, and those are Wild Side and Monster Pile-On. So Wild Side will give your Monster Wrangler, the specific one who's using it, 2 actions per turn. Though
What
they
was
will
that?
double up on whatever you
God
do.
damn it,
Like
man!
specify do this and then this, you can only do it once. The thing is, though, the Monster Wrangler's other ability, Monster Pile-On, whose damage is directly tied to all the monsters you have caught, is the highest damage ability against a single target there is in this game. It is not close. To the tune of like double or triple most other abilities. Now, against more than one enemy, they will spread out this damage a little bit, so it's not quite as effective, but if you're, just using 3 other monster wranglers, it's still going to be enough. And because of the way you get those abilities from, capturing more monsters and the way they scale with the number of monsters caught, your monster wranglers don't even need to be a high level to pull this off. You just have to have, been...
Why do the mobs get to run forever, but I don't? Why?
The end game is really all about stacking these monster wranglers and doing everything you can with them, because damage-wise, nothing else even comes close. That said, though, there are a few things to know about the other classes that I mentioned, such as the merchant's ability to dig up treasure via one of their abilities, the martial artist at their final ability when they get to level 40s gets to guarantee a critical against certain enemies, which can be incredibly useful for killing the big experience monsters called metal slimes or liquid metal slimes that are normally extremely resistant to damage. Things like that max level martial artist ability can just one-shot.
Are you ever going to attack Kate? Are you ever going to attack him? Like, even once? Why even fucking put these worthless NPCs in the game if they don't even attack?
Before going to the alternate abbot, which you'll discover roughly a third of the way through the game, talking to the, abbot there, he will then give them a ritual to change into a different class, which puts them back at level 1, but only halves their stats, so they get better stats out of this while also retaining all the abilities from their previous class, which means if you've got the time and the patience for the grinding, you can make these guys absolute monsters, which is what you're going to need for some of that draconian stuff, because as I mentioned, it is woefully unbalanced, but given how you can just change the difficulty at any time, it's not the biggest deal in the world. Now that does finally, though, leave us with the gear section of gearing up. Now, truth be told, in-game monster wranglers, it's not terribly important. Most of their abilities don't scale off of this stuff, and you'll just want to protect them from incoming damage, which comes down to loading them up with accessories and gear that mitigate a lot of that stuff.
I hate it.
What a given class can wear is actually determined by what...
Please attack him. Please attack him.
Every weapon, they can't all equip every bit of armor, as an example. And some of those
Please
bits of
attack
armor
him,
and weapons,
Kate.
while not
Please.
technically being the highest
Please attack him.
defense,
If you had attacked him 5
have
times, he'd be
useful
dead, but
abilities.
you
Some of
didn't.
them
You
have
spent 7
abilities
minutes
where
and
you
you've
can
attacked
use them
5
as an
times.
item in
Come on,
combat,
man.
which will then
Please
produce a
do
special effect,
something.
as an example.
For
And
fuck's
some
sake.
are just generally more useful because they block or mitigate a certain damage type, which is obviously going to be useful in certain situations. So I would say the gear progression is good overall, primarily because it's not linear, which tends to sometimes be a thing in these JRPGs where gear are just glorified stat sticks, but here they've clearly made an effort to diversify that a little bit, and that's always what I like to see in these games. So overall, progression is interesting. I do think the late game, again, is dominated by the Monster Wrangler, which is new to this game, being
Please do something.
overpowered,
Please
and it's to
attack
the tune
him.
of certain
Please.
bosses clearly being designed around this single class, which is odd because the way the rest of the game works, they never really make a point of doing something like that, which is an odd choice. But then we have the gameplay and world of this one. So, as I mentioned, uses the, I would say, pretty standard overworld map system of these games, kind of sort of open world if you want to think of it that way. And there's a lot to do. While the beginning of it is a little linear, once you get a hold of your ship and can start sailing around, the game really opens up. You're given a bunch of different objectives that you can track down whenever. And while they all have to get done, the order in which you do them is largely up to you. And this is going to see you going around to the game's towns or secret spots, exploring individual continents, while also potentially even taking on the optional dungeons the game has, and even finding little side quests of sorts. And a lot of these little interactions make the place feel much more alive than I was expecting, in a way that somewhat surprisingly reminded me of games like Baldur's Gate 1, where it has a certain veneer of believability, and sure, if you scratch under that, it's going to fall apart, but it's just believable enough to be enjoyable. But then we've got other stuff, like the game's secret spots. These are just little locations out in the wilderness that will often house monsters you can wrangle, or items to be found, and just little stuff like that that aid exploration. The game also uses that day-night cycle that I mentioned, and that matters. Places will change based on whether or not it is day or night. Some things are only available during the day versus the night versus the evening. As an example, you can get spells that will manipulate this for you to make it a little easier, but otherwise you'll have to go rest at an inn to change the time. And while doing all of this, finding out and discovering which character skills are most useful in a given situation, like the zoom ability allowing you to do things like fast travel without having to use an item to do it called a Chimera Wing, or abilities like Padfoot, for instance, that let you ward off low-level encounters without having to use an ability to do so. And you've got a world that is surprisingly interactive for a game this old, or at least the original version being so old. But that's certainly not all. We then have the mini medals, which are little medals you can find scattered throughout the game that if you find enough of, you can bring back to the starting town to get little rewards. And then there are the monster fights themselves. So all those monsters we are wrangling for the Monster Wrangler can in fact be put to use via competitions in some of the towns. We can use the monsters we fought to fight other monsters, sort of Pokemon style, and winning these comes with a whole host of rewards, not least of which though is just straight up cash, which we are going to need to tackle the game's in-game content. So let's talk dungeon design in this particular game. First of all, this game loves its tower dungeons. That's a thing. There's like 5 of them. That is to say, towers you will slowly climb and then you can jump off of certain ledges to fall down to certain points on other floors, that kind of stuff. And most of that is pretty fun. But where the game took a turn for me, as I mentioned, was some of the late game dungeons being monsters using a dozen or so turns to just spam you with group sleep, group paralyze, or instant death abilities, which is obviously very annoying, especially when you get to a place called the Maw of Necrogond, which is likely where you're going to experience this for the first time. And I don't necessarily think that's a huge problem, because honestly at that point you'll have likely just sort of figured out how to manage your MP to last you until you get back to town, for instance. So once you've got all that mastered, the game throwing a new challenge at you isn't anything crazy. I don't love the way that they did it, mind you, as extremely long dungeons full of these monsters that just completely incapacitate your party every single turn, get real old real fast. It's still doable, but once you finally reach the game's post-game, you can unlock the 2 post-game dungeons, which take this all the way up to 11. Now first, you're going to go through what is kind of generally referred to as Heaven in order to fight a boss that will then grant you a wish if you defeat him in a certain amount of turns, which I talked about earlier. One of those wishes that you can get actually leads you to a second post-game dungeon called the Temple of Trials. The Temple of Trials, it is my understanding, actually replaces a different dungeon back in, I believe it was the Game Boy Color version. The Temple of Trials is not fun, and the fact that it's new to this game is disappointing, because whereas the Monster Wrangler winds up being extremely overpowered if you put in the effort to make it so, the rest of that class's kit is clearly designed to fit in with all of the other classes in the game. And despite those problems with the dungeons I've mentioned up to this point, it really does feel like you can mess around with these classes even if there is clearly a best option. The game doesn't restrict you in that way. Well, the Temple of Trials kind of does. So basically what this place is that you have to pass 5 different trials to unlock the game's super boss, which ironically, if you can get to that game's super boss, should be a walk in the park. Now, a couple of these trials are honestly pretty easy in the sense that you basically just have to prove you have done the game's content. This is done in the form of one of them just requiring you to have caught almost all of the monsters. Another trial simply being honestly sort of a money check, where you have to buy a bunch of items and bring it back to the spirit, and then one of those items it will request is going to cost you like 1,000,000 gold if you don't want to spend forever farming it, and that's okay because you can actually do the new monster fights to get that gold pretty easily, which if you've caught all the monsters will be a really easy thing to do. And then a third trial asks you to bring a bunch of legendary items, one of which you actually get from also doing the monster arena fights, so there's kind of some synergy there. And then the others are from doing some side quests which rewards you with unique gear. So far, so good. The problem is the last 2 trials of the 5. These 2 trials require you to move through an area with 2 specific weapon types, and if you're not using those types, you get debuffed into the ground, taking like 10 times normal damage from enemies and dealing 10 times less. Enemies will hit you for like 2,000, and to put that into perspective, your max health is 999. And then just for a laugh, at the end of it, they have you fighting the only other enemy in the game that seems to have access to Omni Heal besides your main character, which will cause them to heal their entire party to full, which means unless you have a character with a very specific spell to simply remove these other characters from the battlefield called Blasto, you're probably just not going to win. And that's a problem for 2 reasons. One, as I mentioned earlier, gear is restricted by class, so if you want to use the weapons to avoid that debuff, your characters have to be in a specific class at that time, which is very likely going to throw apart some of your initial synergies here, because every time you reset your class, that character is taken back down to level 1, even if it's a class they've already been in. So simply put, both of those trials are awful, and they are the icing on the late game unbalanced cake. which is a shame because I typically find that in post-game stuff, that's kind of where you're having the most fun. You're wrapping everything up. Maybe some extra challenges here and there, but man, oh man, the last few dungeons of this game are just a real damper on an otherwise fun experience, and I wanted to call that out in depth. Sure, might not be a big problem for most people, and there is that lower difficulty mode, which makes it to where you can't die, but as an example, that lower difficulty mode is actually not good for those trials. Because you're dealing 10 times less damage, it might actually just put you in a fight that you cannot win, even if you have the right weapons and stuff equipped, because those enemies at the last bit of those trials cast Omni Heal, and if you don't have a character with Blasto, you're still not going to make it, which is infinitely more frustrating than it is fun. But with that in mind, let's talk a little bit about combat here. So a few notable things right away. You can assign tactics to individual characters in your party and then just auto battle your way through everything, though like most instances of this, that works for a lot of regular enemies, but for bosses, you're almost certainly going to have to do things manually. Luckily, there is a battle speed up option no matter what you're choosing here, so you can make the battles move much faster, which I always enjoy, so there's some decent quality of life stuff there. Now, the tricky part is targeting. So a lot of abilities and even just like straight up attacking things, you don't actually get to choose the enemy you're hitting in most cases if it's not actually targeting the entire group of enemies, which even then, depending on their position on the battlefield, you might not even actually hit all of them, which is honestly a little bit frustrating. But realistically, if you've ever played a turn-based JRPG before, you should certainly be good to go. Most of it should feel pretty familiar to you, I would imagine, as otherwise you basically just use your turn to activate either the tactics of an individual character or to manually set what you want them to do via their abilities, spells, or just straight up attack based on the weapon they have equipped. Really not too much to explain there. The one thing I did want to mention, though, is that if you want to use items and stuff in combat, they need to be held by that character. Each character has an inventory, and then your equipment and items can have their own separate inventory if you want. Now, if you want to use an item or a bit of equipment in combat, it needs to be on that character. So if you want to use, say, the revive item, Yggdrasil leaves, you have to put those manually in that character's inventory for them to be accessible. And then from there, it's really just about party comp and whatnot. Now, a couple of just general notes otherwise, though, is that your hero character, again, starts off pretty strong, but falls off about the mid-game in terms of damage compared to other classes and things like the Monster Wrangler. Chances are your main hero is actually going to wind up being your healer because they're pretty good at it, which also makes them a handy character to activate items from their inventory to help keep your other party members in just fighting shape by doing things like making sure that they stay sort of uncrowd controlled to make sure that they can actually hit the enemy on their turn and things like that. But otherwise, learning what each skill or item or ability does and when to use them appropriately and how to set up your team for success is decently enjoyable if you've ever played these types of games before, but it is, I would say, largely just due to the time the game actually came out. Not exactly the craziest implementation of a combat system, but I will say it is still a very accessible way of approaching an older game like this, and I think they did a good job of adding some quality of life there, if anything. Which brings us to the Steam Deck section. Probably not a surprise at all for a game that released on the Game Boy Color at one point, but the Steam Deck runs this game very well. It's verified over there, has all the features you'd want. Realistically, I'd be surprised if you had a problem there, and because of the nature of this game, it might actually be preferable to play it on that particular platform. Really, the only note for it I have is that sometimes, randomly, the game might change resolution on you, and you'll have to go in and manually change it to make sure it pops back in to take up the entire Steam Deck screen, but otherwise, honestly, pretty flawless experience. Which brings us to our positives and negatives before we wrap this thing up. So on the positive side of things, again, love the HD 2D graphics. I really enjoy that art style. It is a great way to play older classics, especially because along with the art style just being a little easier to parse, while also looking great, these remakes come with a whole host of other features and accessibility options, while also adding a little bit of content that keeps it fresh even if you played the game previously, but also makes it a great jumping in point for a classic that you might want to experience for yourself in the way that I did. So in that sense, the remake is fantastic. Combine that with bits of the story I talked about, like moments where quests interact with the game's actual mechanics that make it feel like a world in a way you might not expect for a game that was originally quite old, is really impressive impressive, and I think for that reason, this remake is, again, a fantastic way to experience a lot of that for yourself. But on the negative side, we have a few things to mention. First and foremost, the price. I think $60 for this is probably asking a bit much, just period. While I enjoyed this, I don't know that I'd want to pay $60 for it, especially because it is a remake of an extremely old game. And while they did add some, of course, accessibility options, that new class, and a little bit of content as a sort of default there, the fact remains that this is still mostly a better looking version of a game that has been out for a long time, and while I think that's worth experiencing, reality is time has sort of marched on nonetheless, and so I just could not see myself paying a full $6 for this. And that's before we even start talking about those late game dungeons I experienced and how I think very unbalanced that last part of the game is, as it plays and feels very different than the rest of it, and you notice that pretty much immediately if you're actually trying to do those things. And that brings me to my conclusion. Basically, on one hand, Dragon Quest III HD 2D Remake is a fantastic way to experience an old classic, but it still has some problems I would have liked to have seen cleaned up, and moreover, the price is too high. I would simply wait for a sale on this one, and if you can catch it for around like $30, $40, I think you would have a great time at that price. And with that, I think we're going to call this one a review. So hopefully you enjoyed all that. If you did, don't forget to like, comment, subscribe, all that YouTube jazz. But regardless of any of that, truly, just thank you so much for watching. I really do appreciate it. May you wander in wisdom and have an amazing day. What's going on, everybody? Mortem here, this time bringing you my review after 100% for Baldur's Gate 3, some months after the game's official release.
The asteroid is depleted.
Oh, wow, Vladimir Zelensky did Lex Friedman
soon. Then it will be easier to fly in.
Yes, I think that the war will end and President Trump may be the first leader to travel here by airplane. I think it would be symbolic by airplane.
Again, January 25th, around that date, right? Flying in, meeting the Air Force One.
That would be cool.
There is a perception of corruption. People like Donald Trump and Elon Musk really care about fighting corruption. What can you say to them to gain their trust that the money is going towards this fight for freedom, towards the war effort?
In most cases, we did not receive money, we received weapons. And where we saw risks that something could be a weapon, we would slap everyone on the wrist. And believe me, this is not only about Ukraine. On the supply chain, everywhere, there are some or other people and companies who want to make money because everyone makes money on the war. We did not profit from the war. If we found someone, believe me, we slapped everyone on the wrist. And we did that, and we will continue to do so because to this day, when someone says that Ukraine was selling weapons, and by the way, Russia was the one pushing this narrative, we always responded. Our soldiers would kill such people with their own hands, without any trial. Do you honestly think anyone could steal weapons by the truckload when we ourselves don't have enough on the front lines? And yet we have to provide proof to defend ourselves. Because when there's an abundance of such misinformation, distrust starts to grow. And you're right, people listen to various media outlets, see this, and lose faith in you. In the end, you lose trust. And with it, you lose support. Therefore, believe me, we are fighting more against disinformation than against particular cases, although I still emphasize once again, at the everyday level, such things are still important. We catch these people, and we fight them. As if Putin wants to sit down and talk. But Ukraine does not. This is not true.
I think that, yes, he is, in fact, ready to talk.
Did you talk to him?
On the phone or what?
How do you normally talk to him?
I don't know. Normally by the sea. The same as with you. He invites you to the sea with me. Just the three of us.
No, one of us may drown.
Who? Are you good at swimming?
Yes, I'm a good swimmer.
You're a good swimmer. Well, if you think that the president of a country is completely crazy, it is really hard to come to an agreement with him. You have to look at him as a serious person who loves his country and loves the people in his country. And he conducts, yes, destructive military actions.
Who are you talking about now? Who loves his country?
Putin. Do you think he doesn't love his country?
No. What is his country? He happened to consider Ukraine his country. What is his country?
When do you think there will be presidential elections in Ukraine? The following is a conversation with Volodymyr Zelensky, the president of Ukraine. It was an intense, raw, and heartfelt conversation, my goal for which was to understand and to do all I can to push for peace. Please allow me to say a few words, first about language, then about the president, and finally about history. Please skip ahead straight to our conversation if you like. We spoke in a mix of languages, continuously switching from Ukrainian to Russian to English. So the interpreter was barely hanging on. It was indeed, in many ways, a wild ride of a conversation. As the president said, the first of many. Language, like many other things in a time of war, is a big deal. We had a choice, speaking Russian, Ukrainian, or English. The president does speak some English, but he's far from fluent in it. And I sadly don't speak Ukrainian, yet. So Russian is the only common language we're both fluent in. In case you don't know, the Russian language is one that the president speaks fluently and was his primary language for most of his life. It's the language I also speak fluently, to the degree I speak any language fluently, as does a large fraction of the Ukrainian population. So the most dynamic and powerful conversation between us would be in Russian, without an interpreter, who in this case added about 2 to 3 second delay, and frankly, translated partially and poorly, for me at least, taking away my ability to feel the humor, the wit, the brilliance, the pain, the anger, the humanity of the person sitting before me, that I could clearly feel when he was speaking fluently in the language I understand, Russian. But all that said, war changes everything. The Ukrainian language has become a symbol of the Ukrainian people's fight for freedom and independence. So we had a difficult choice of 3 languages. And faced with that choice, we said yes to all 3, to the consternation and dismay of the translators. We make captions and voice-over audio tracks available in English, Ukrainian, and Russian. So you can listen either to a version that is all one language or to the original mixed language version with subtitles in your preferred language. The default is English overdub. On YouTube, you can switch between language audio tracks by clicking the settings gear icon, then clicking audio track, and then selecting the language you prefer: English, Ukrainian, Russian. To listen to the original mixed language version, please select the English UK audio track. Big thank you to 11 Labs for their help with overdubbing using a mix of AI and humans. We will continue to explore how to break down the barriers that language creates, with AI and otherwise. This is a difficult but important endeavor. Language, after all, is much more than a cold sequence of facts and logic statements. There are words, when spoken in the right sequence and at the right time, that can shake the world and turn the tides of history, that can start and end wars. Great leaders can find those words, and great translators can help these words reverberate to the outskirts of a divided civilization. On another note, let me say that President Zelensky is a truly remarkable person and a historic figure. I say this as somebody who deeply understands the geopolitical complexity and history of the region. I am from this region. My parents were both born in Ukraine, Kiev and Kharkiv. Both my grandfathers too.
Go Lex.
I was born in Tajikistan and lived for a time there.
But you don't speak
then
Ukrainian.
Kiev,
Huh?
then Moscow, then
But
United
you don't speak
States.
Ukrainian?
And while I am now, for almost 30 years, and to the day I die, am a proud American. My family roots grow deep in the soil of nations that comprised the Soviet Union, including Ukraine, Russia, Belarus, and Tajikistan. I've gotten to know and have spoken for hours with members of the president's team and people close to him. I spoke to hundreds of Ukrainians since 2022, including soldiers, civilians, politicians, artists, religious leaders, journalists, economists, historians, and technologists. I've listened to hundreds of hours of programs that both support and criticize the president in Ukraine, in Russia, in the United States. I've read countless books about this war and the long arc of history that led up to it. If forced to recommend two, at this moment, I would say The Russo-Ukrainian War by Serhiy Plokhy and The Showman by Simon Schuster, which is a good personal behind-the-scenes biography of the president, focused on 2022. But there are many, many more. This is why I can comfortably say that he is a truly singular and remarkable human being. It was an honor and pleasure to talk with him on and off the mic. Now, it is true that I plan to travel to Moscow and to speak with President Vladimir Putin. And I hope to be back in Kiev as well. As President Zelensky said, this was our first of many more meetings. In all these cases, I seek to do my small part in pushing for peace. And in doing all this, I'm deeply grateful for the trust people have given me on all sides. For the people attacking me, sometimes lying about me, for the critics in the stands, chanting the latest slogans of the mass hysteria machine like the sheep and animal farm. I love you too.
I know, right? I love you
and
too.
I assure you that drawing lines between good and evil on a world map is much easier than seeing that line between good and evil in every human being, including you and me.
Yep.
This is what I try to do. I'm simply a human being who seeks to find and surface the humanity in others. And, as I've said, no amount of money, fame, power, access can buy my opinion or my integrity. Now, finally, please allow me to briefly overview some history to give background for several topics that President Zelensky references in this conversation. I recommend my conversation with Serhiy Plokhy and many others about the history of the region. But here, let me start with 1991, when Ukraine declared its independence and the Soviet Union collapsed. From this point on, Russia-Ukraine relations were defined in large part by whether Ukraine aligned more with Russia or with the West, meaning Europe, United States, NATO, and so on. In 2004, with the Orange Revolution, a pro-Western candidate, Viktor Yushchenko, became president. In 2010, it went the other way. A pro-Russia candidate, Viktor Yanukovych, became president. the internal tensions grew, and in 2013, Euromaidan protests broke out over Yanukovych's decision to suspend talks with the European Union in favor of closer ties with Russia. This set forward a chain of important events in 2014. On the politics front, Yanukovych was ousted and fled to Russia, leading to the election of a pro-Western president. Also, in 2014, on the war front, Russia annexed Crimea and war broke out in the Donbass region of eastern Ukraine, which eventually killed over 14,000 people and continued
Rest in
all the way
peace.
to 2022, when, on February 24th, 2022, Russian forces initiated a full-scale invasion of Ukraine. This is when the world started to really pay attention. Now, some history of peace talks. Volodymyr Zelensky won the presidency in 2019, and he discusses in this conversation the ceasefire agreements he made with Vladimir Putin in 2019, which was one of many attempts at peace, from the two Minsk agreements in 2014 and 15 to a series of ceasefire agreements in 2018, 19, and 20, all of which failed, in part or in whole. All this shows just how difficult ceasefire and peace negotiations are, but they are not impossible. It is always worth trying, over and over again, to find the path to peace. I believe that Presidents Zelensky, Putin, and Trump should meet soon after January 20th this year and give everything they got to negotiate a ceasefire and security guarantees that pave the way for a long-lasting peace. We discussed several ideas for this in this conversation. As I said, this was one of my main goals here, to push for peace. This trip to Kiev and this conversation was a truly special moment for me in my life. It is one I will never forget. So to reflect, I say a few more words and answer some questions at the very end if you like to listen. But here, let me say thank you to everyone for your support over the years. It means the world. This is the Lex Friedman Podcast. And now, dear friends, here's the President of Ukraine, Volodymyr Zelensky.
If we can explain why the Ukrainian language is very important, our conversation will be most effective and impactful if we speak in Russian.
I speak Russian perfectly, of course, and I understand everything you are talking about. However, I can't respond in Russian the entire interview. It's because this is how it is today. I am not making anything up. You can see it all for yourself. You can feel and hear it. Today, there were 73 missile attacks against us, and people were killed. There were over 100 drones today, and this is a daily occurrence. The people who attack us, they speak Russian. They attack people who were only recently told that this was actually in defense of Russian-speaking people. And this is why I respect neither the leader or director of today's Russia, nor the people. That's it. And I don't think that you can just pretend that nothing's happening and give Putin a pass once again for saying that we are one people, that we speak one language, etc. They speak the language of weapons. That is a fact. And we are peaceful people. Peaceful people who want to protect themselves and defend their freedom and their human choice. You know, at the beginning of the war, I addressed Russians in Russian. Zero effect. They're mute. They do not listen. They did not listen. Some are afraid, some have other issues, they have different reasons. It's like when a person is drowning and people walk by because they can't hear them. And someone walks on by crying, afraid to save them. It doesn't change anything for the one drowning. They need someone to help them. This is why I honestly despise these people, as they are deaf. They began the occupation in the supposed defense of the Russian language, and that's why, with all due respect, I would like to give an interview in Ukrainian. This is very important to me. If there are some points that you want me to explain in Russian, I can certainly do that. I can certainly occasionally speak Russian. But in general, no. I'm not sure that you will understand me completely. Despite your Ukrainian roots, you are a citizen of the United States, right?
Yes.
That's why I'm surprised that you don't understand. Well, it was a long time ago. I understand that it was a long time ago. Moreover, a lot has changed. A lot has changed.
If I may please allow me to say this in Russian. Yes, many things have changed, but I have hope. I hope that today many Russians will hear this, that Vladimir Putin will hear this, that the American president, Donald Trump, and the American people will hear this, that everyone will hear this. And yes, Ukrainian language is important symbolically, but what is also important is that we understand each other well.
For Donald Trump? Is it important for Donald
Yes.
Trump whether I speak Russian
Yes.
or not?
Yes, because unfortunately, and it hurts to admit, but I cannot speak or understand Ukrainian yet. So your wit, dynamism, and your humanity will not come through as well and as quickly. Remember, I need to wait for 2 to 3 seconds to hear it. You have a great sense of humor, great stories. With an interpreter translating, I simply won't see this, but I understand that it's painful. Another reason is that I hoped we could show that even though it is sometimes said that Russian is banned in Ukraine.
This is not true. I'm speaking Russian now, right? We have people who speak Russian. This is not true, really. It's not. It's really not true. We disrespect Russian now because of Russians.
Yeah, because
That's
of the
all.
war.
When they were saving Russian speakers,
Yeah.
they killed Russian speakers. Many people who actually, many of whom are in the East, right? In the East, they lived in the East. They destroyed their houses, destroyed their lives. It's not a rhetorical thing. It's not all talk and blah, blah, blah. I don't have time for blah, blah, blah. Yes, so it's a very, very important and sensitive moment. The message is that we are not one nation. We are not, the same country. We're different countries. Yes, different countries. And I think what is most important is what we're talking about. Not how. We're speaking about it. This is what I think. You're a smart guy. So you have a lot of experience in dialogue of this kind. That's why I think you will understand me. Yeah, anyway, I think it is far better for Donald Trump to hear my English, not my Russian.
Your English is much better than my Ukrainian. You're getting better and better
That's
every
true. I'm a very honest guy. That's why I will be very honest with you.
Okay.
Your Ukrainian is not very good, but we will work on it.
Yes. I have many flaws. That's one of them.
Sometimes I can speak English. Sometimes, as I understand, we can be very flexible, right?
Very flexible. Spanish, Swahili.
Yeah, you see?
Yeah.
We are
Javier
very
Malay needs to
flexible.
understand this, so.
By the way, Javier understood me without any words
The language of love, maybe.
of respect.
Respect.
I respect him. I had a very good conversation with him. Really brilliant.
May I sometimes speak Russian and sometimes English?
Yes. You can use any language you like. And I think that's a very good rule for this first meeting between us. As you said, maybe we will meet in the future for the second time.
Second and third and fourth?
Yeah, this is good. You can ask questions in the language you'd like, and I will answer in the language I can.
Well, you said you wanted to meet by the sea at some point. So, for our next meeting, let's meet by the sea.
With pleasure. Next time, it would be much better to meet by our Ukrainian Black or our Azov Sea.
You know, I've been to a lot of... I have traveled to many cities in Ukraine, but I have never been to Odessa. And everyone tells me that, and I don't know why.
You have to.
Can you explain to me why everyone loves Odessa so much? What's there?
You know, what's in Odessa? That's how they say it. What's there? In Odessa, we've got it all.
Okay.
Odessa. I love Odessa because of its particular temperament. People have their own accent, and it's so. There are many nationalities, you know. There are a lot of stories. Authentic Odessa cuisine. By the way, you know, the cuisine is very different from others. The dishes are not like any other dishes, and everything is very tasty. Also, there are beautiful people. And today, you know, you understand people very well, especially after the attacks on Odessa. You understand what the people are like, just how Odessites are, very Ukrainian. And that's very cool. I love Odessa. I go there several times a year. I go there several times a year now because, well, now because of strengthening of air defense systems, because of this grain corridor, etc. I go there more often. They have the sun there. They have the sea. It's Ukraine and it's very cool there.
Well, when you come and visit me in Texas as a guest for the third time,
With pleasure.
let's do this. How about you, my friend Joe Rogan, and I will go get some Texas barbecue together?
Who will pay?
It's a good question.
Putin. For everything. He has
Well-
to pay.
Well, yes, we'll invite him too.
No.
Okay.
Without him.
Okay, I get it. Understood.
But if the Rome Statute will be accepted by your government before this moment,
By the way, I don't know if you know this, but Joe has a great comedy club in Austin.
Joe Rogan,
Joe Rogan, yes. And I think that as a person who respects comedy and stand-up comedy, it would be interesting for you to have a look at it.
no, he is. I know him, and I saw a lot of different videos. He's a very talented person. So it would be a pleasure if you invite me, and I'm able to do it. I am a little bit busy,
Yeah.
but if I'll be in the United States, I hope that I will have a conversation and a meeting with President Trump. And of course, during my visit, if I'll have the time, it would be a pleasure if you'll invite me. With pleasure.
You know what? I will pay.
Good.
Yeah. I had to think about it, but you are the president.
Yes, with you, with pleasure.
When the war is over, please come.
Thanks
and
so
when
much.
you're less busy.
Thanks so much.
If we can go back many years, World War II. Tell me the story of your grandfather who fought in World War II.
My grandfather, he graduated from the military academy, and from the very beginning of the war, he went to fight. He was in the infantry, and he fought through the entire war. He had many wounds. As they used to say back then, his chest is covered in medals, and it's true. He had more than 30. Yes, more than 30. He was the kind of man. He was such a serious man. I loved him very much, and we had a very close relationship. He didn't like to tell details about the war. He never boasted. Although I asked him, as a boy would, how many fascists did you kill? He never talked about it. He believed that the war was a great tragedy, a tragedy for everyone. And Ukraine was occupied, and it was a tragedy for Ukraine, a tragedy for Europe, and a tragedy for the Jewish people. His own brothers, his entire family were executed. They were tortured by fascists who had occupied Ukraine and their village. His father was the head of the village, and he was killed. They were shot. It was a mass grave, right? Yes, it was a communal burial. Some of them were killed outright, and others were buried alive. His 4 brothers, they all went to war. As soon as the war began, they were all there. He was the only one who had a military education, and they all died in the war. He was the only one who came back. He had nobody. He came back, and he found my grandmother, his future wife, and she managed, what was it called then? I don't know, they don't have them anymore. It was a childcare facility, an orphanage, so to speak, a place where orphans lived, children who don't have parents, children of war. And she managed this childcare facility with difficult children, as they used to call them, difficult children who went through the war, who saw their parents killed, and this is how they met, because these difficult children, they, well, sometimes behave differently. They could steal something, do something bad. There were many, many children in the orphanage. Yes, that's how she met my grandfather. And I loved him very much. And I think that my grandfather, frankly, would never have believed that this war is possible. He would never have believed it. Because he worked in the police after the war. He was a colonel. He worked in criminal investigation all his life. So he fought with bandits all his life after the Second World War. But also, I believe he fought for justice all his life. And we all lived in one apartment. And even after his death, I lived with both of my grandmothers and my parents, two grandmothers, who both lost their husbands. Both of them died. Well, it was an ordinary family that lived like everyone lived back then in the Soviet Union, and even after the Soviets in the 90s. We lived in one apartment all together. What else is there to say? But I think the most important thing was values, respect. They gave me an education. My parents gave me an education. No one left me money or apartments, so I didn't inherit anything material. But I believe that our real inheritance is here, in our minds and in our hearts. I believe that.
There's 1 second delay.
Yeah.
So if I'm sorry if you
It's fine.
tell a joke, I will laugh about 1, 2, or 3 seconds later. There's a delay. So,
Ordinary family, but not an ordinary time. World War II.
World War II. Speaking of mass graves, I was at Babin Yar yesterday. A large part of my family died there. In moments like this, such a place serves as a stark reminder of the profound historical gravity of the Second World War. I remember this song from my youth. On June 22nd at 4 o'clock, Kyiv was bombed and the war began. I always wondered how it would feel to live in a moment when everything changed. The path of humanity completely shifts in a single moment, just like that. What do you think about that moment in 1941? Now, after the 2022 invasion, how do you perceive the Second World War after you have witnessed all of it?
Well, firstly, the war actually started earlier. It started here in Ukraine. Kyiv was bombed, as you quoted. But the war had already begun before that. And I think I perceived it as a start of the full-scale invasion. Well, I think it's hard. It's hard to understand why nobody wants to listen, look at, and analyze history. War, the rise of fascism and Nazism, the emergence of Hitler, Goebbels, and their entire team. At the time, this wasn't just about one party or even one country. It was essentially a wave of hatred, a wave of one race above the rest. They were, in fact, constructing and ultimately implemented a theory around this idea, later seizing Europe. They created a theory of one nation, one race, one world. Their world. Of course, this idea is absolutely senseless, but it has become radicalized over the years and even gained support. A vision of one world. And in principle, the so-called Russian world, the ideology Putin promotes and imposes, it wasn't originally like that. He was a different person back then, or maybe he was always like this, but his rhetoric was different. At the beginning, remember, he talked about the EU and even about Russia's future being tied to NATO. There were even talks of joining the European Union, NATO. He spoke about shared values with the West. That's how it all sounded back then. And we must also look at Hitler, who was seriously, before the radical idea of taking over the whole world, he actually made certain steps, and everyone believed he was helping the economy. And to be fair, he did take some steps in that direction. But he was a terrifying person. None of those actions justify him, nor do they excuse his actions. And that's why we cannot look at the Second World War as if it started in 1939. It didn't begin in 1941 either. We need to draw conclusions. When did it start? With the weaknesses of the world. The division of European states, the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact. All of this happened before 1941. People who were more informed, those who dug deeper, whether they were politicians or not, whether they were from different walks of life, including business, which was different back then, were speaking about all of this. Hitler won't stop. There'll be a world war. Hitler will destroy nations. Nations. And that's what happened. Someone looked the other way. What I told you about. Europe was sinking then. I gave you an example of it. But the whole world looked the other way and didn't pay attention and said, no, we can negotiate with him. I'm telling you, he is okay. We can negotiate with him. He's just more right-leaning. Or it does not matter what they said. He's just very pro-nationalist. This is all nonsense. And this is not the first time. And Hitler isn't the first such case in history. We're dealing with a person who is allowed to stick to this desire to destroy. He was consumed by it and enjoying it. And what happened to Hitler? Now, what about Putin? This invasion was also at 4 in the morning. Around 4 in the morning, there were missile strikes on Ukraine. This is the same. I believe that intentions are also the same, but more on that later. By the way, you tell me if this is too long, you can stop me.
Never long enough. It's beautiful.
Okay, so it happened here around 4 in the morning. Before this, I must honestly say, everyone said something, predicted something, etc., but I asked only for one thing, primarily from the United States. If you are sure, if you have the evidence, if you talk to him and he tells you that there'll be an invasion, if all this scares you. I only asked for 2 things. Send us weapons, or better yet, strengthen us with preventive measures so there would be no war. It wasn't the weapons that I was asking for. I asked for sanctions. Intimidate him. Please don't say that. If he comes, if he crosses borders, if he kills, we're imposing sanctions. Well, this is complete bullshit. Sorry, but really...
Oh, I understand this.
Oh, wonderful, yes.
I understood one word.
Yeah.
So they did not help.
I believe that no, and this is a fact. We didn't receive help. If we assume that words are help, well, then yes, we received a lot of it because there were plenty of words. Even more than plenty, yes? At
Help?
4 in the morning,
No.
there were strikes. Morally, is it possible to prepare for war? No. It doesn't happen like you read in books, see in movies, and so on. What happens to you? I was just looking at my wife and children. My children were asleep, but my wife was awake. There were strikes, missile strikes, we heard them. To you, as a living person, how can this be? You just can't fully believe this. You just don't understand. Why now? Given everything that happened in World War II, when millions of people died, none of it mattered. Still, at 4 in the morning, around 4, 3:40, 3:45, remember? Around this time, yes, there were missile strikes. And later, by the way, a few days after the first days of the war, I spoke with Lukashenko on the phone. And he apologized. And he said that it was not me. Missiles were launched from my territory, and Putin was the one launching them. These are his words. I have witnesses. And I apologize, he said. But believe me, that's what he told me. Volodya, this is not me. I'm not in charge, he told me. I'm not in charge. These are just missiles. This is Putin. I told him, don't do that. This was done without me. That's it. He just, on the phone, I remember this conversation. I told him that I believed. I told him, you are a murderer too, I'm just saying. And he told me, you must understand, you can't fight the Russians. I told him that we never fought them. I said, it's war. The missiles came from your land, from Belarus. How did you allow this? Then he replied, all right, retaliate then. I still remember him telling me, hit the refinery. You know how much I care about it. Moser Oil Refinery, is that it? Can't recall. Moser Oil Refinery. I told him, what are you on about? What retaliation?
Forgive me, Volodya.
Yes.
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 This was at 5 in the morning?
No. This was during the first or maybe the second day. Second or third day of the war.
Ah,
yes.
I see.
Well, after that, I went back home. I was home with my children, with my wife. I just went to my wife very quickly that night at 4 o'clock. Yes, and just told her, get the children, get ready. You'll probably need to go to my office very soon. And I left. That's it. At this moment, you're no longer a father. What happened to me, unfortunately, because I believe that this is, and not only do I believe, I understand, especially now that all of this is the most important thing, because your country is your family. The strength is in your family, and this is the most important thing. And I'm the president, and therefore I had to stop being a father in my own family. And my wife had to do everything. She had to do everything regarding children, regarding safety. And I had to deal with the state because I'm the president, and this is my duty. And I, by the way, am taking this very seriously. I went to the office, and here we are now. You're very welcome.
Well, at that moment, on February 24th, 2022, everything changed again. Just like in June 1941. Everything changed. And history took a turn. The history of humanity took a turn. And for you, too. Well, you were the president. You were talking about fighting corruption, about the country's freedom, about interesting and innovative reforms. But that morning of February 22nd, everything changed. Could you tell me about that morning, the details of your actions? When you had to quickly make difficult decisions. What was the process for you? How did you make these decisions? Did you discuss them? with people you trust to understand how to respond to this invasion in every technical, political, and military aspect. What was the process for you? How did you make the decision?
According to our legislation, in principle, I'm the supreme commander of the armed forces of Ukraine, so I had to give corresponding orders. Yes, I have a military office, and then later there was a military headquarters where all key people gathered. This is not only about the military, it's about energy, etc., all key things. But at that moment, I made the decision quickly and without a doubt. And I cannot say that I am just that kind of person. I'm just a living person who believed that if help is needed right now, to help evacuate people, help with children. Several cities were blocked. I was only thinking about how to deliver food there within a day. We did a lot of things, although we understood that they, in fact, occupied part of our state. And we distributed weapons to people. That's how it was. Trucks came and simply distributed weapons to people so that they could defend the capital to ordinary people, just on the street, to ordinary people who understood that if the Russians entered the city, then we would have the same thing that's happening in other cities per the information we received. Thanks to digitalization, by the way, we had very good digitalization before this. We preserved a lot, and even when they were surrounding certain cities, a lot of things still worked. The banking system, the internet, we had television, and thanks to this, I made several decisions to ensure that people are united and have all the information. Russia is very good at spreading large-scale disinformation. Fortunately, I have 2 decades of experience, managing a production studio, TV channels, and large media resources. I understood that we needed to build an information network very quickly. Thanks to this, I began to address the people constantly. This happened several times, 3 to 5 times a day. In fact, I became that an information source for people who were in cities that were cut off from other information. And it was very important for me to keep all things digital, to keep the internet, to stay in touch with everyone, with all the people. Initially, that's the contact we had. And then we also built a media platform, so where we had all the news agencies of Ukraine. And this network was called Marathon. And it was also very important for the people to trust us. And people had to receive information. Why? There were waves. There were waves of Russian on the first day who said he ran away. I had to go out into the street. I left the office and went outside. I had to do this because I was showing that this was no green screen, to show that it was the street, not some digital manipulation. I mean, I did these things, then I touched various objects. Now, people might think that these are small things, but I was actually showing that I was in a real place. All of this had an impact. I was absolutely sure my actions. And these contacts, several contacts, and then I spoke to the Russians, I addressed Russians, I really did. And then only after that, I gathered, it was the first day when I invited all of the journalists here, wasn't it? That was on the first day, I think, well, not here, to the press center in this building. I talked to journalists, I asked them not to leave because we needed weapons. At that moment, they were handing out rifles to people. And for me, journalists, And media platforms were essential voices. There were various journalists from different countries here, and they were essentially stuck. And I asked them for contacts, those who had access to Russians, Belarusians, Kazakhs who understood everything, the same information. And I spoke to them. And I spoke to them and spoke in Russian. I told them, you must stop Putin. This is terrible. This is horror. This is war. You must stop him. And if you stand up now, if you speak out, and if you go out into the streets, this was very important. I spoke to them in Russian to show them that there was no problem and that all of these pretexts were made up. This is why it's so painful to talk about the Russian language too, because look, if a person does not want to listen, they will not listen no matter what language we speak.
I disagree with you here. I think and hope that many people in Russia will hear us today.
They blocked YouTube recently. Are you aware of this? In their country.
I know. And I simply guarantee that this conversation will travel fast on the internet. Everyone will hear you.
Simply guarantee.
They will hear you.
I think so too.
Including the president of Russia will hear you. This is why I have hope.
This is why I have hope as well.
He is actually deaf, even if he speaks to you.
Yeah.
He is deaf by his very nature. Do you understand the difference? You know, for instance, when you talk to Musk, you're talking to an innovator, a scientist about rockets. You talk about how to save on costs and how they land. And on the other hand, Putin doesn't launch rockets to save money, but to kill people. Do you think you can talk to Putin about technology? Your guys were interviewing him, and he told them about tribal history. Do you understand? Imagine a Russian man in his country listening to him. You know what Musk is about? Technology, Mars, artificial intelligence. And this guy, Putin, is standing there bare-assed, pontificating about tribes. You've got to understand. You think that when you do interviews, like Mr. Tucker, who did an interview there, that you're about to make them friends. How could you? What does this have to do with friends? He's different. He is simply different.
But it's still necessary.
A mammoth stands before you.
By the way, I must say that when you said bare-assed, it was not translated. Could the interpreter please translate?
This is so that you can understand.
Now he explained everything to me. I understand.
Yeah? That's
now
great.
I fully understand.
That's
Anyway,
great.
But we still need to talk.
One should always speak with someone who listens. And you must speak when you know that this will benefit you, bring peace and calm to the world, not the other way around. I love President Trump's message when he speaks. I think that we share a position on peace through strength. That is very important. It means that if you are strong, you can speak. And we need to be strong. And Ukraine has to be strong. Strong enough. Otherwise, what for? So, you know who, like Voldemort, who must not be named. Yes, he's like Voldemort. He thrives, subsists, and lives on being subjectivized. Instead of isolation, he is offered to step out into the light. He's darkness personified, and you offer him, as it were, to be subjectivized. Why? There's only one reason. Fear. And you say, we need to talk. Listen, we need to be in a strong position and not talk, but end the war. Yes, it is possible through dialogue. We're not opposed to it. You just need to be in a strong position to make the other person want it. Do you think he wants to end the war? That's what you suggested? I think this is naive. I'm sorry. With all due respect, it's naive to think he wants to finish the war.
I do too.
It's
Tell you what.
I think it's
the
naive.
circumstances. Sorry for interrupting. There's something we need. I think that President Trump not only has will, he has all these possibilities, and it's not just talk. I really count on him, and I think that our people really count on him. So he has enough power to pressure him, to pressure Putin not into wanting to stop it. No, he will not want to pressure him to actually stop it. That is the difference. Don't rely on his will, Putin's will to stop. You won't see it. That's what I think. Sorry.
No, sorry, I interrupted you first. But what I would want, I do have what some might call a naive dream of you sitting down with Putin and Trump and negotiating a deal about a ceasefire and together finding a path to long-term peace. And I think this
You're a
requires strength,
fool, Lex.
requires negotiations. There are a lot of carrots and sticks here that can be used to make
I
a
haven't
real
heard anything
deal.
that funny in a while.
And Trump is very keen on making a deal and ready to negotiate.
Can I ask you a question?
No.
Yep. I just
You are naive.
really want
You're
and I to
naive
be
because you're
on
young. You're younger than me. Something about it, 15, 20 years younger than me. It's naivety. Yeah, I do want to answer. Yeah, I do. 3 o'clock. I'm sorry, guys. I've got to take a break here, so I'm going to pause the video and kill the stream. Maybe I'll just go. Maybe I'll just stop now. So yeah, we've been doing this a long time. I think we could probably stop. Let's go turn in before I have to leave. And yeah, got a lot of stuff done here, and I need some twine. No, I don't need twine. I need cloth. Cloth is harder. I don't remember how to get cloth. Is it like simple saw table? Is it masonry? No, and it's not simple mortar, refined pigment, or seeds. I'm looking for cloth. I'm looking for cloth. How do I get cloth? No known entries for cloth. Jesus Christ, man. Come on. Crafting, come on. I need to know how to get cloth. You're dumb. You're dumb. That's such a short list compared to all the stuff that I can make. Oh god, the developer might not be that good. The developer's really good, but there's some stuff here that just blows me away. Well, okay, I'm going to stop this stream now and publish these videos. And, yes, oops, gotta stop here. So, you've been watching Skycat Live. I'm going to stop here, guys. Thank you so much. I was going to keep going but and flip my schedule, but I think by the time I get to sleep, it'll be like 5 or 6 anyways, so that'll be fine. And so, sorry, I'm stretching. Oh, God. Okay, so, what else? I am Skycat Live. I'm a full-time variety gamer all day, every day. Put me on the background. Click on the cast faces, donate. Come to the Twitch or the YouTube to give me a like, sub, or a follow. I have thousands of videos on my YouTube channel. Please stop this. Please stop making that sound. Please stop that. You're fucking so no shut the fuck up. Fucking tech and software developers. Okay, so... yeah, hey, we're looking good. We published, yay. So let's get the next set up as soon as the last set went out. So, gonna stop the video here. Thank you so much, guys. Oops, stop streaming. Stop streaming. Yeah, no, but I do want to stop the video.